From the studios of Foxboro Cable Access, located in the center of Foxborough, Massachusetts, you are watching Around Foxborough.
Good evening, this is Joe Sanders and I'm your host for Around Foxborough. And today we have some very special guests. I'd like to welcome both of you. George Popham, the founder of the Bay State Learning Center, and J.J. Mudridge, co-director, as I understand.
Yes, sir.
So welcome to both of you, and well, let's just say welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you
It's
here.
good to be on the show.
So I'm really interested and excited to hear what you have to say about your learning center. I understand it was founded about 12 years ago, and so I guess what I want to ask, and this will hit the core of, I went on your website, I read your mission statement, that mission statement, and it made sense to me. But I'd like you to describe a little bit, George, as the founder. Tell us, what is it, why would someone choose Bay State Learning Center?
Well, there's a lot that's unique about our program, right? And we'll get a chance to get into that. But the most striking difference for me is the level of attention we can give to each student. People in the micro-school movement, people in liberated learners have discovered that, a tiny student community allows parents to know each individual child really well. When I was in public school, I was processing sometimes 120 students a day. And I didn't know any of those kids very well. Not only do I know our kids, I know the quality of their relationships, I know their families, and that changes the game very dramatically.
Very, very much so. So I think the underlying thread for why anyone would choose Bay State Learning Center is because they're not thriving within a traditional schooling model for any number of reasons. There are the initial reasons that you come to mind when you say that someone's not doing well in public school, but the sheer number of reasons is myriad, and it comes down to they want something out of their education that traditional schooling models aren't able to give, whether that's more flexibility or more autonomy.
Well,
I just want to add, sometimes, students that are really, when I taught in public schools, and I taught in public schools, private schools, charter schools, there was always a subset of students who were really intelligent and creative, but left their schooling experience thinking they weren't good at school or weren't very smart or feeling unsuccessful. And I felt like that was just really untapped potential, and that if you could change things about the environment and its structure, you can draw more out of those students.
Right. Well, you mentioned something, I got to say it resonates with me. Now, I work in a middle school now, full-time, and I've only been teaching this year. This is the first time I've taught in a public school. And I find some similarities there will be some students where I have time to develop a relationship with. Usually it's someone that needs extra help, and I'm with them, and when you're in that one-on-one kind of situation, you get to know more about them, and maybe they learn a little bit more about me, and it builds that trust. And I think that when I read about Bay State Learning, about the trust you can build in the smaller class size, could you talk a little bit about that? Because that resonates with me, and I'm very interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, here's the thing, there's so many things when I started this I didn't expect, right? I was working in public schools, traditional schools, and I just felt like I wasn't connecting with students, though I really enjoyed working with them, right? And one of the things I discovered teaching at Bay State Learning Center is I work with students, we both do sometimes 3, 4, 5 years in a row. So you have this sort of important role in their development, and these relationships extend beyond the years that they're at Bay State. Several of our graduated students come back and teach small classes and have internships, so these developing of long-term relationships is super important. Also, too, we're non-coercive. We don't judge or grade, we work individually with the students. So, if they have a strength, we build on the strength. If there's a weakness, we can talk about that. But it kind of ends the adversarial nature of the relationship average teacher-student situation often contains.
I have to bring this up before I forget it, because you said something that I hadn't thought about in years. And I can't even remember exactly when I heard about it, but when they're talking about performance. And it says, don't try necessarily to fix all your weaknesses or get better. Find out what you're really good at and just keep doing it, And it kind of reminds me a little bit about your charter of going with the strengths and self-directed. That was one of the things I read about in the background here of some of the self-directed things and getting to know the students. Can you comment at all about either one of you on that?
Well, I did want to add to what George had said first, which is very much like I've heard. George and I have both been classroom teachers. All of our staff at Bay State have been in a traditional schooling model on both sides of the desk. And a lot of the time within traditional schooling, I've heard like, well, we lead with their strengths and then, that's how we get them to do the math or the reading that they're not that good at. But at Bay State Learning Center, because we have relationships outside of show us what you can do, that part of that trust is that there's not a bait and switch, that it's not, I think you're a cool, interesting person, and I'm not thinking that just so I can get you to do math next year.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also want to add that, one of the ways I encapsulate this in a short, in a short formulation is we're an engagement model over an achievement model. We're looking to get kids engaged with things passionately where their interests are really tapped into. And once that starts, the achievement comes along for free.
Yeah. Regulation before expectation.
I like that. Comes along for free. That's very interesting. I did a lot of reading when I first learned that you were going to be on the show, because truthfully I wasn't that familiar with you before. And it talks about kids, it says here 10 to 19, I don't know if that's a fixed rule or if that just happens to be the ages when, is it like fifth grade? Is that where what is it? Start with middle schoolish?
Yeah, usually we find that, if kid, as JJ started out by telling us, right, the kids that end up at Bay State are kids for whom traditional education models just aren't working for one reason or another. They're anxious, they're doing school refusal, they're just not willing to walk in the front door.
Right.
And then they come to us, right? And so, we find that starts happening right around middle school.
Okay.
Right? So that's about where our age range starts. And, we don't have grade levels either. Any kid can take any class.
Okay.
And the bulk of our kids are between about 12 and 17.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And we go to about 19, particularly because it can be developmentally appropriate for those children to stay with the students to stay within a safe space. And when that happens, there are a number of things that we do, which is ask the student to teach a class. If they're going to be older in this space, we've had a number of really, really interesting, engaging student-led classes, because everybody at Bay State Learning Center is both a learner and a teacher. Or, they're doing community college courses virtually in the space and using us for additional help. And I think it's really, really important to have that sort of free age mixing. That's one of the first things in traditional schooling models that goes out the window. 8th graders are with 8th graders and 12th graders are with 12th graders. So they're not really having peers to look for in modeling, in mentorship. Who can I be who's not yet a grown-up? And I think that's really, really important.
Right. Something, we didn't talk about this before, but it just comes to mind as I'm hearing you discuss and describe your model and how it works. A big problem in schools in general, in the public schools, is bullying. And I was just wondering, does that ever rear its head, or do they develop relationships there where it almost doesn't occur?
This is one of those advantages to having like the micro school model, right? If you've got a group, and there are numerous sociologists and anthropologists who've written about this phenomena. When you have a small enough group, it takes on a village-like format. And the students that might, in a large school environment, prey on each other, end up being protective of each other.
Yeah.
They feel a real sense of ownership. It's their community. They've developed the norms and the rules.
Yeah.
And their sense of ownership means that they don't tolerate. If some new kid comes in and starts acting out in those ways that are typical in traditional school, the adults barely have to step in. The kids will be like, that's not how it works here.
That's really neat. That's really neat to hear about that.
And they do that in a way that says, hey, you're one of us, and we want you here, but that's not how we do it.
Yeah.
We really take care of each other here.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. And I think it makes sense, because when you talk about, in any time you talk about the smaller groups, right? You can't do things in anonymity as you could if you were a part of a large group where you say, well, that wasn't me, no, everybody knows each other, right? And everybody takes care of each other, like you said. I've always believed, any place, even in a traditional, even college, one of the selling points of some of them is small classrooms, small classroom size. Again, the individual attention. And that's taking your model and even expand. They brag about it. You know, I mean, that's the way it was at West Point. They bragged about West Point because, you know, 15, no more than 15 people in a classroom. Little did they tell me then that was because they could keep an eye on me. But anyway, you talked about in our earlier discussion the liberated learners. Can you expound a little bit on that, George?
Yeah, I was teaching at a charter school in 2013, and I had gone out to Western Mass to visit a friend, and we were driving along, and I saw the sign for North Star Self-Directed Learning for Teens. And I just, at that point, was so dissatisfied with my teaching experience that I just turned in and grabbed a couple of pamphlets and talked to the guy who founded it, Ken Danford. He started it in about 1995. And his main idea, and I think the idea for all of us is, if school isn't working, you don't have to stay there. Right? You can pursue your education in a number of really creative ways outside of a traditional school classroom. And while we do offer classes, one of the things we do is we teach students to self-direct their education. I mean, most adults, right, learned most of what they learned outside of a classroom.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we learned some primer stuff in a classroom, then we went out in the world and had our experiences.
Right.
So, telling a kid that's miserable in a public school, you know what, you can quit yesterday. It's over. That experience is done. We can give you a set of skills that enable you to educate yourself just as well as anyone else without having to go through that process.
Right.
And we get them in college too, right?
We absolutely do. And I think that process is fundamental for students learning that education isn't something that is inflicted upon them, right? Like I see students who at first don't know how to engage in self-directed education because every second of their day has been structured. They don't know how to engage with the text because there are right answers and wrong answers, and there's not my opinion. What do you think and feel about this? What does this remind you of? And I think part of what we do at Bay State helps us see learning as play, which makes for lifelong learners, which makes for people who are enjoying their education and engaging in it with it for the sake of it, rather than, well, I got to get a grade, or I have to do this so I'm not grounded by my mom, or I can get into a good college. And that's how you continue being a lifelong learner.
So I was wondering, this to me would be very interesting, or you tell me if it's appropriate, without naming names, could you kind of give if there's such a thing, or not even a typical, but how would one come from where they are to inquiring about how to become a student at Bay State?
Well, we have a website, Bay State Learning Center, and there, send us an email, give us a call. Right, we're happy to talk to anyone. The parents that end up at our door are usually, like I said, parents who didn't expect to be looking for alternatives, right? But something has not gone well, and so we're this alternative model that is available. Every student at Bay State Learning Center has become a homeschooler.
Yeah.
Right. That's because we have to have maximum flexibility to address the needs of all of our members.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And we, that's really no problem. We're very, we know how to help parents to navigate those waters. And
now, when you say become a homeschooler, were they homeschooler before they contacted you, or is that part of?
A significant number of them are homeschoolers before they contact us, but a lot of them are just people who are just seeking an alternative to school.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. I think you've answered one of the questions I have, though, of what differentiates your school from the traditional, but I don't think it would hurt to summarize somewhat, the obvious differences,
Yeah, so every student at Bay State Learning Center is paired up with an adult mentor, and they get one-on-one time each week to use that for however they see fit, but a lot of the time it's working on personal or academic projects and, leaning into the mentee-mentor relationship. A lot of people who come to Bay State at first don't really know how to do the freedom, don't really know how to be flexible within their education, and are sort of like just in a state of shock. So that relationship helps people direct their education at Bay State. And, we see it for the whole time they're there. But it does come down to community. It takes a village, and I think one of the things that we're doing at Bay State Learning Center is teaching people how to be a villager.
Okay.
Not just that it takes a village. So
Sure.
we're learning about, interdependence, and sometimes, I'll let George take some of this because.
Well, I'm about to do my riff about the conversation, right?
Yeah.
I believe that all learning is really part of a great conversation. Conversation requires people to listen and then, to respond, right? And when you learn that education is nothing more than correct answers on a test, then you go out into the world in possession of your list of correct answers and just shout them as loudly as you can at everybody, right? And this doesn't make for a good conversation.
Right.
I think in many ways, culturally, in our political and our social scene, we've lost the capacity to listen to each other, right? Yeah. And so, one of the things we do is because we have such a small community, we're able to facilitate real conversations. We teach kids to listen and respond. And from that, you can grow almost any kind of educational endeavor you want.
I can't help but bring up Ted Lasso in one of those scenes when he talked about nobody ever asked him about if he played darts. I don't know, that scene drove me crazy, but it was about listening again. I wanted to you were talking about that, and I had something in my mind. I can't remember it right now. Oh yes, extracurricular activities. Because we talked with some of the students in a different interview about sports and theater. What opportunities do students have? Are there teams or schools, or is there any activities?
It's interesting because at Bay State Learning Center, there isn't that big of a distinction between curricular and extracurricular.
Okay.
There's a student band. Music has been very popular. We actually got a grant and got a whole bunch of recording equipment and music equipment. We're lucky in that we have a number of different parent volunteers and volunteers from the community who come in and teach. And we had a sound engineer, Rafi Sofer, who works at Q Division Studios, and he put together a fantastic music program for us that has just perpetuated itself. And so that's one thing. Students have a singing group. There are occasionally students who are into theater. We have access to the stage in the building. And so, so basically, if students are interested in it, we can develop an activity in it. Most recently, live action role playing. A bunch of kids have made, foam rubber swords and shields. They're out in the parking lot whacking each other. It's, whatever the kids want to do. And that's the really vitally important thing is that we develop all of our activities and curricular, offerings with the students. They have input, the parents have input, and we come up with something together. It's really not that hard.
And all that being said, just to give an idea of some of the huge breadth of what we do, there's students right now who are very into making their own clothes. They got a loom that they fixed up themselves. We've had painting workshops, we've had makeup workshops. There's a student-run animation class. There have been student-run drawing classes. And one of the best things about not necessarily differentiating between curricular and extracurricular is that when a student wants a class or they feel a gap, they can ask for it. And there's enough resources that we can have a geology course. Yeah, we can have an astrophysics course.
Wow. Well, I took down some notes before I met either one of you. And one of the things that I had written in quotes was student-led initiatives. It certainly sounds like there's a lot of that going on.
Sure.
Yeah. And part of, that JJ touched on this earlier, but I wanted to emphasize every student is given a staff advisor. And we really prioritize the scheduled time that you get with your advisor if you're a student at Bay State, because that's how we get to know the student. We as staff then share that information. That's how we find out who's interested in what, and that is part of what is the glue that holds this community together.
Well, again, before we met, I went to your website. One of the things I wrote down, which struck me as very powerful, was the topic of mentoring and the theme of you build trust first, and that goes to the point where you just said about that takes the priority, especially early on, where building that trust matters more than anything. Because if they don't trust, then they forget about it, right?
And a lot of students, in a traditional environment know that the teacher has an agenda. I need to get certain scores on certain tests. I need to produce. And, at Bay State, I want every student to know that we value them just as they are.
Yeah.
They don't have to perform in some special
Right.
way. That's how the trust is built. And from there, again, the education part's easy.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. I had many years in the Army and different leadership jobs, and I don't know. I guess I have always subscribed to what you're saying. I always took the time to get to know every single person that was in my group. Often, meet with them privately to get to know them a little bit, and I found it helped me out as the leader of the group because I never had to never felt like people were doing things behind my back because I built up that relationship with them. It was a good feeling.
You asked about bullying earlier, right?
Yes,
Is
yes.
that there's, the social dynamics in the student community are absolutely transparent to us as teachers.
Yeah.
When I was in much larger schools, I had the feeling often that something's going on, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah, you can't really. So again, the ability to hide behind whether it's technology or numbers, right, is a big thing. Well, I'll tell you, I'm very impressed with what I've read so far, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the schools, or your school, I should say. And is there anything that we haven't touched on that you think you'd like to mention to anybody who's seen this and maybe learning about it for the first time?
That there are other options. That traditional schooling models is not the only way. Public, private, whatever, like any sort of traditional schooling model. There are other ways. And homeschool doesn't necessarily look like you doing school at home, you sitting there with a checklist and checking off all of the subjects. That when learning is seen as play, that's really where the magic happens. There's a lot of hard science for learning being seen as play, and a lot of the processing that's happening in the middle school and high school years happening through social environments. I think students need the unstructured time to be social, to figure out conflicts, to figure out what their public or group persona is and feel comfortable in that. And within traditional schooling models, there's not a lot of time for that. And when there is, it's very micromanaged.
Yeah.
We trust our students to do that. And that can be scary for some parents. So I say that at Bay State, we're not working with individual students, we're working with whole families. So we're also sort of helping parents who might be nervous about, school refusal, or, well, you're non-coercive, what if they choose to do nothing? To think about what we do here and think about rest also as work.
Yeah.
I always like to point out to parents who have that concern, what if they do nothing? Nobody does nothing.
Yeah.
And nobody wants
And
to do nothing.
We're a non-coercive model. So sometimes, a kid comes to Bay State and they're like, I can't believe my good fortune. I don't have to do anything. Great. And they plop down on the couch and they pull out their phone and they test us. Do they really mean it? Are they really going to just not make me do anything? And, the only thing that happens is the advisor comes down at the scheduled time and says, hey, do you want to meet? You want to talk? They don't want to. We're like, fine, okay. But at some point, 3-4 weeks into that, the kid kind of wakes up and goes, nobody's driving the boat.
Yeah.
Well, what do I want out of my life? How do I want to spend my time? What kind of a person do I want to become?
Right.
And that's when the magic starts.
Yeah, I believe that's a fascinating story. Fascinating. I can see that.
It's a common pattern.
Some of the things that, you mentioned the opportunities to do that kind of thing in the public environment are few and far between. The parts I love the most about teachers is when I get that one-on-one, maybe with a student that is either goofing off or needs extra help, and we can have a moment where it's not related to the topic, we bond during those moments. And then over time, it builds, but it's not enough. Not enough opportunities for that. And I can see if that were the model that everybody in the school uses, it's fantastic. So
you got the right idea, Joe.
Yeah.
Once you get to know the student, then there's all kinds of options. There's ways to work any situation.
Yeah. Well, we could go on a lot longer, but we have run out of time. So I'd like to thank George Popham and J.J. Mudrich from the Bay State Learning Center. That's it for today for Around Foxborough. I'm your host, Joe Sanders, and we'll see you next time.